I'm writing this because some truths don't disappear just because you hide from them. I've hidden from mine for years, pretending the choices I made weren't as damaging as they were. Pretending that leaving my husband and my son was a moment of weakness instead of something deliberate. Pretending that the emotional connection I formed with another man wasn't actually an affair, just because it never became physical. Pretending that I left for logical reasons, not because I was scared, tired, and selfish. But the truth doesn't soften just because time passes. It waits. It grows heavier. And, eventually, it demands to be acknowledged. When I first met Chris, I thought he was the most hopeful man I'd ever known. He had this steady fire in his eyes, this unshakable belief that he could change our lives with his bare hands. He wasn't unrealistic, not exactly, but he saw life through this lens of possibility that I didn't have. I fell in love with that. With him. With the idea that maybe we'd rise together and beat every statistic stacked against us. Things were never easy financially, but in the beginning, we had enough. Enough to get by. Enough to laugh, to argue, to dream. Enough to fall asleep on each other's shoulders after long shifts, still whispering about the life we wanted one day. When I got pregnant with our son, I thought maybe the struggle would finally settle into something stable. Something we could handle as a team. But struggle is unforgiving. It doesn't pause for children or dreams. It grows like mold around the corners of your life until one day you realize everything has a veil of it. Chris was a salesman, and sales can be good, or they can be devastating. Some months were manageable. Some were disasters. And then one day, he came home with those bone density scanners. Big, clunky, expensive machines that took up half our living room. He was glowing with optimism, explaining that these machines were going to change everything, that doctors would buy them, that he would finally have a real business, that our lives were about to turn around. I tried to match his enthusiasm. I tried to see what he saw. But inside, I felt the sharp stab of anxiety. Our rent was already behind. Our utilities were overdue. We barely had groceries stocked. And here he was putting our savings, our last little bit of breathing room, into machines that sat there like silent statues mocking me every time I walked past them. Still, I loved him. I tried to trust him. I tried to believe that his plan had more substance than fear. But the bills didn't care about his dreams. They kept coming. I started working longer hours. Overtime. Double shifts. Anything. I was exhausted constantly, but exhaustion felt safer than fear. Fear that we wouldn't make next month's rent. Fear that the electricity would be shut off. Fear that one emergency would destroy us completely. Meanwhile, Chris kept trying. I won't pretend he didn't. He hustled with those machines. He carried them to clinics, doctors' offices, hospitals. He went door to door. He made calls. He tried everything. But trying doesn't guarantee income. Not when the world feels hell-bent on breaking you down. And in the middle of all this, something subtle but dangerous happened to me. I started feeling invisible in my own home. When Chris talked, it was always about the next sale, the next doctor visit, the next possibility. When he was quiet, it was because he was thinking, strategizing, studying, fighting his way out of an invisible cage. I knew he wasn't ignoring me on purpose. He was drowning in pressure too. But understanding that didn't lessen the loneliness. The emotional affair didn't happen overnight. It started with simple conversations at work, harmless ones, or at least that's what I told myself. He was just someone who asked how I was doing, who actually listened when I spoke, who noticed when I looked tired, who commented that I seemed stressed. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't even someone special. He was simply the first person in months who made me feel seen. From there, things escalated in a way I didn't realize until I was too deep in it. Longer conversations, venting, talking about my marriage, talking about how scared I was. He told me I deserved stability, that I was strong for carrying so much weight, that I shouldn't have to feel alone in my own house. That hit me harder than I want to admit. I need to say this clearly, I never cheated physically. I didn't cross that line. But the emotional boundaries? I shattered those. I shared parts of myself I should have only shared with my husband. I let someone else hold the emotional space Chris should have held. And Even if Chris never knew it happened, I did. And I knew it was wrong. Still, like most people caught in something they can't fully define, I justified it. I'm not doing anything, I told myself. I just need someone to talk to. This isn't cheating. I'm just lonely. But there's no lonelier feeling in the world than lying to yourself. Things hit a breaking point the day Chris told me he wanted to apply for an unpaid internship at a brokerage firm. Unpaid. While we were already drowning. While I was working myself into exhaustion. While those scanners still sat unsold in the living room like reminders of every misstep we'd taken. I felt something inside me crack. I snapped in a way that wasn't fair, but also wasn't completely unjustified. I yelled. He yelled. I cried. He tried to reassure me. I told him I was sick of reassuring him. I told him I was tired of carrying everything. He told me I didn't believe in him anymore. And the worst part? He was right. I didn't. I was terrified, tired, angry, lost. And the emotional support I'd been receiving from someone else blurred my perspective even further. Suddenly, Chris's dreams felt like personal attacks. His optimism felt like irresponsibility. His determination felt like ignorance. For the first time, I looked at him and wondered if loving someone was enough. The final straw was the night we got served another eviction warning. Chris had missed an appointment with a doctor who was ready to buy a scanner. I came home from a long shift and found him exhausted on the couch with our son asleep on his chest. The TV was on mute. The room was dim. He looked so tired, so broken down, and instead of compassion, I felt rage. We fought again. Loudly. Painfully. Saying things that stick to your ribs long after the moment ends. And then something inside me just quit. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet. Cold. Final. I stood there looking at him. This man who loved me, who was trying so hard, and all I felt was suffocation. I packed my bags that night. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed space, that I'd come back when things calmed down, that leaving wasn't the same thing as abandoning. But deep down, I knew I wasn't coming back. When I closed the door behind me, an unfamiliar silence fell over me. Not peace. Not freedom. Just emptiness. I walked away because I was weak enough to choose the path that felt easier, even if it hurt the people I loved most. Chris didn't chase me. He stood in the doorway holding our son, looking at me like I had just torn something out of him. He asked me not to go. He asked me to stay until he figured things out. He asked me to give him time. But I didn't have any time left. I left them both standing there. And as soon as I reached the end of the street, I collapsed into tears so violent they shook my entire body. Not because I didn't love them, but because I did. And I was still leaving. I spent that night at a coworker's place. The emotional affair guy helped me find a room to rent in the following days, but strangely, once I left my home, whatever connection we had fizzled instantly. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was realization. Maybe it was that he only filled a void created by stress, not by lack of love. Whatever it wasn't real. And I began to understand that too late. Meanwhile, Chris and our son were still there, alone, struggling, trying to make life work without me. But the worst part? It was only going to get harder from here. The first week after I left was a blur of exhaustion, guilt, and denial. I moved into a small rented room with a narrow bed, a cracked window, and a lamp that flickered every time I turned it on. It was nothing compared to the tiny apartment I had shared with Chris and our son, but at least it wasn't filled with reminders of everything I had failed at. That's what I told myself, anyway. People talk about freedom like it's this great, liberating force that washes over you the moment you break away from something heavy. But real freedom, when it comes from running away instead of running toward something, feels like grief dressed in disguise. It doesn't soothe you. It doesn't empower you. It just exposes you. The silence in that room was the worst part. I wasn't used to silence. I was used to Chris's late-night pacing, our son's giggles echoing down the hallway, the sound of dishes clinking when Chris washed them because he wanted to let me rest, even when he was exhausted too. I was used to arguments, to hope, to frustration, to noise. Now, there was nothing. Just me. Just the consequences of my choices humming in the air. I avoided calling Chris. I avoided reaching out. I didn't know what I would even say if I did. How's our son? Are you still drowning without me? Do you still believe in that dream I walked away from? Instead, I told myself he was better without the weight of my resentment. That without me snapping at him every night, he might focus better, breathe easier. But that wasn't the truth. That was just another excuse to avoid facing what I had done. The emotional affair contact fizzled almost immediately. He texted me a few times asking how I was settling in, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. The warmth I once felt when talking to him felt tainted now, distorted, shameful. I realized that the intensity of what I'd felt for him was born out of exhaustion and loneliness, not genuine connection. He was never meant to be a replacement for Chris. He was the distraction I allowed myself to lean on when everything else felt like it was collapsing. And I think he knew that too, because after a few unanswered messages, he stopped trying. And just like that, the person I had emotionally leaned on had evaporated from my life. I was completely, utterly alone. A few days later, a mutual acquaintance from my old job called me. She complained about the mess at the workplace, about new policies, and then casually mentioned, "Hey, I saw Chris the other day. He looked tired. Really tired. Like he hadn't slept for days." She laughed a little, not knowing how the words stabbed into me. I hung up quickly. That night, guilt crawled all over my skin like something alive. I pictured Chris sitting on the edge of our old apartment couch, head in his hands, our son tugging at his sleeve asking for dinner or milk or help with something. And Chris, exhausted, stressed, but trying, forcing a smile and saying, "Daddy's here, buddy. Daddy's got you." I broke down crying. Not soft, movie scene tears. Violent tears. The kind that choke you. The kind that punish you. The kind that remind you that you walked away from something irreplaceable. But I still didn't go back. Pride is poison, and guilt only makes it stronger. I kept telling myself it was too late, that going back would only make things worse, that I'd already made my choice. So I stayed in that empty room and let the silence swallow me whole. Money became a problem quickly. I had rent to pay now, food to buy, bills that weren't shared anymore. I worked more hours, but the exhaustion felt heavier than ever because there was no one waiting for me at home. No little voice saying, "Mommy." No husband asking if I ate. No warmth. No purpose. But at least I wasn't fighting with Chris anymore. That was the lie I kept replaying in my head. One cold morning, about 2 weeks after I left, I saw Chris by accident. I was on my way to work, standing at a bus stop, wrapped in a thin jacket that didn't shield me from the wind. And then suddenly, across the street, I saw him. He was holding our son's hand, trying to balance one of those heavy scanners on his other arm. His coat looked worn. His posture slumped. He looked older than he had the last time I saw him, like the stress had aged him overnight. Our son was bundled up in a jacket that was too big, probably donated or secondhand. He looked up at Chris with pure trust, and Chris looked down at him with exhaustion mixed with love. They didn't see me. I stepped behind a newspaper stand and watched them walk. And then something broke inside me so sharply that I had to grip the cold metal pole to keep myself upright. He was doing it alone. Everything we once did together, he was now doing alone. I watched as they waited at the crosswalk. Chris shifted the scanner on his hip, adjusting it so he could hold our son's hand properly. He rubbed his eyes when he thought no one was looking. He looked thinner, tired, but he held onto our son like he was the last piece of hope he had left. My throat tightened. My eyes burned. And for the first time since I left, I felt something worse than guilt. I felt regret. I wanted to run across the street. I wanted to take the scanner from his hand, to hug my son, to apologize, to say I'd made a mistake, to say I wanted to come home. But I didn't move. My feet were concrete. My body was frozen. And the bus pulled up, blocking my view. When it left, Chris was gone. I carried that moment with me for days. It replayed in my head like a cruel film loop I couldn't pause. The eviction notice came soon after, for him, not for me. I heard from another coworker that Chris had been forced out of the apartment and was staying in a motel. That he was selling what little furniture we had left just to keep food on the table. That he was still trying to sell those scanners, still clinging to the belief that something would work out. I felt sick. Physically sick. Every instinct in me screamed to go to him.
To help.
To be the wife I promised I'd be. But something in me, fear, shame, cowardice, kept me from knocking on that motel door. Instead, I stayed in my room, curled up in bed, feeling the kind of pain that tightens around your heart like a fist. Days turned into weeks. Chris juggled his unpaid internship, hustling those machines, and raising our son. I don't know how he did it. I can barely breathe thinking about everything he endured while I was away. One evening, when I was heading home from a late shift, I overheard two bus drivers talking about that guy who walks with a kid and a huge machine. They were laughing, saying he always looked like he was in a rush, like he was late for everything, like life was running faster than he could keep up. I sat in the back of the bus with tears rolling down my face, silently. He was doing everything he could. Everything. And I had abandoned him at the exact moment he needed a partner. A turning point came when I learned from someone that Chris and our son were sleeping in public bathrooms some nights. That the shelters were full. That he would sit on the floor hugging our child through the night, whispering stories or humming softly, so he wouldn't feel scared. I felt something in me die knowing that. What kind of mother walks away from that? What kind of wife lets her family suffer like that? I hated myself so much during those days that even the mirror felt like an enemy. I avoided looking at my reflection because I didn't recognize the woman staring back. But still, I didn't go back. I wish I could explain why. I wish I could say it was because Chris didn't want me anymore, or because he told me to stay away. But none of that was true. The real reason is uglier. I was afraid he wouldn't forgive me. I was afraid he'd look at me with resentment instead of love. I was afraid of taking responsibility. Afraid of returning to the struggle. Afraid to face the version of myself I had become. So I stayed away while the man I once promised forever to was fighting a war alone. But then one ordinary afternoon, something happened that changed everything. My phone buzzed. It was a coworker from the hospital. She said she saw Chris again, but this time, he looked different.
He looked happy, she said.
Like something finally worked out for him. The words didn't make sense to me. Happy? How could he be happy after everything he'd gone through? But then she added, I heard he got some kind of offer. Something big. My heart pounded. My breaths grew shallow. Chris? An offer? After months of seeing him struggle, cry, break, and still get up the next day? Could it be real? That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling until sunrise, replaying every moment of our life together, every fight, every dream, every mistake. I felt hope and fear tangled together in my stomach. Had he actually made it? And if he did, what would it mean for us? For me? For the life I left behind? I found out the truth a week later. It happened in the most ordinary way imaginable, through whispers from people who didn't even realize they were delivering the most important news of my life. I was stocking supplies at work when two nurses walked in, chatting casually. One of them said, Did you hear about that guy who used to come around trying to sell those medical scanners? The tall one with the little boy. My heart stopped. My hands froze around the clipboard. The other nurse laughed.
Yeah, him.
He looked like a walking storm cloud for months. Poor guy always looked like he hadn't slept in a year. I held my breath, waiting. Well, she continued, I heard he finally got hired at one of those big brokerage firms downtown. Like, actually hired.
Paid. Full-time.
Apparently, he aced some crazy internship. The clipboard slipped from my hands and clattered onto the floor. The nurses turned toward me, startled, but I couldn't pick it up. My fingers wouldn't move. My mind was racing so fast that everything around me blurred. Chris got the job? The job he had sacrificed everything for? The one I said was impossible? The one I had abandoned him over? Suddenly the room felt too small, like I couldn't breathe in it anymore. I mumbled something and rushed out, barely hearing their voices calling after me. Outside in the cold air, I pressed my palms to my knees, trying to steady my breathing. I should have felt relief,
Hope.
happiness for him, but all I felt was a crushing weight inside my chest. He did it, and I wasn't there. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying every conversation we'd ever had about that internship. Every argument. Every moment I'd dismissed him. Every time I'd told him he was dreaming too big. Every night I'd fallen asleep angry instead of supportive. I thought leaving him was justified. I thought I was escaping an impossible situation. But now it was clear. Chris had been right. He always believed he could do it, even when I didn't. Soon after, I heard that Chris and our son had moved out of the shelters. Someone mentioned seeing him wearing a suit, holding his son's hand with a kind of pride that had been missing for months. Another said he looked lighter, like the world had stopped crashing down on him. Each new piece of information was a sharp twist of guilt, but I couldn't stop listening. It was like watching a movie of a life I had once been part of but didn't belong to anymore. One afternoon, I couldn't resist. I walked downtown toward the brokerage building I heard he worked at. I told myself I wasn't going to go inside. I just wanted to see it. The place that had changed everything. The place he had fought for. The place where he stood now, confident and capable, while I stood outside like a stranger. The building was tall, glass reflecting the sky. People in suits passed in and out, talking on phones, carrying briefcases, rushing through revolving doors. I stood across the street watching them, wondering if Chris was among them, wondering if he had already walked past me without noticing, wondering if fate was cruel enough to place us on the same sidewalk without letting our eyes meet. Then, as if the universe heard my thoughts, the doors opened and Chris walked out. I froze. He looked different, not physically, but in presence. He walked with a steadier stride, shoulders back, chin lifted. His suit fit him well, like it belonged on him. He looked proud of himself, of how far he'd come. And holding his hand was our son, wearing a small backpack and a bright smile. They looked happy. Real happiness. The kind that comes from surviving the worst and finally being able to breathe again. My chest tightened. Tears threatened. I ducked behind a bus stop shelter before he could see me, but I kept watching through the reflection in the glass. Chris knelt down to fix our son's backpack strap, brushing his hair gently with his hand. Our son laughed and hugged him around the neck. Chris lifted him up and kissed his forehead. It was a moment full of love, full of peace, full of everything I had once wanted for them. And I wasn't part of it. That was the moment I truly understood the permanence of what I had done. I had walked away believing I was sparing myself pain, but really, I had only spared myself growth. Chris had grown. He had risen. He had survived. I was the one left suspended in the past, stuck in the moment I walked out the door. I stood there until they were gone, swallowed by the crowd, and then I sank onto the cold metal bench and cried. Not the guilty tears I'd cried before. These were different, deeper, heavier. Regret tears. The kind that don't wash anything away, that don't heal anything. They just mark you. That night, I considered calling him. Over and over. I typed messages and deleted them. I held the phone and imagined what I would say. How do you apologize for abandoning someone when they were fighting for their life? How do you explain that you only realized their strength after you left? How do you say, I miss you, without sounding selfish? Around midnight, I wrote the longest message I had ever typed. It was a confession, an apology, a plea. I told him I was proud of him. I told him I was sorry for everything. I told him that I hoped his life was good, that he deserved every bit of joy coming his way. But I didn't send it. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed, and then I deleted it. It didn't feel right. He didn't need my ghosts resurfacing. He didn't need reminders of pain he had already healed from. Reaching out now would have been for me, not for him. And I had done enough selfish things. Time moved on. Months turned into years. I kept track of Chris's successes the way someone keeps track of a distant celebrity they once knew personally. Articles started mentioning him. Interviews. Motivational speeches. Photos of him and our son standing together at corporate events, smiling like they had conquered the world. They had. and I watched from afar, proud and shattered all at once. I never remarried. People came and went from my life, but no one stayed long enough to replace the void I had carved out myself. Not because men weren't interested, but because I couldn't let anyone close. I couldn't offer someone my full heart when pieces of it were still tied to a man I had walked away from. Maybe it was punishment. Maybe it was loyalty twisted into regret. Maybe it was just the truth. I had loved Chris deeply, and I never truly stopped. Sometimes I dreamed about a different version of our life. One where I had stayed. One where we fought through the hardship together. One where I held his hand on the nights he doubted himself, where I encouraged him in the mornings he felt defeated. One where our son grew up seeing his parents united through struggle and triumph. In those visions, Chris would come home after landing the job, and I would run into his arms. We would cry together, relief, joy, pride. We would celebrate together, build together, rise together. But that version of our life only exists in my imagination. In reality, I was the one who didn't believe. I was the one who walked away before the miracle. I was the one who failed the family I loved. Years later, I saw the two of them again, not in person but on TV. Chris was being interviewed about his journey, about how he went from homeless to successful. He talked about his son, about never giving up, about pushing through the darkest moments. He didn't mention me. Not once. Not even indirectly. It was like I had been erased from the narrative entirely. And honestly, I deserved that. When the interview ended, the camera caught them walking off stage together, Chris with his arm around our son, both smiling. I reached out and touched the TV screen gently, my fingers brushing lightly where their figures disappeared. "I'm proud of you," I whispered to an empty room. "He'll never hear it. He'll never know it came from me. He'll never know that I still think about him, about our son, about the life I abandoned. He'll never know that I watch from far away, silently cheering for every success he earns." Chris became the man he always believed he could become. I became the woman who didn't believe in him when it mattered most. And that is a regret I will carry for the rest of my life.